Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Driving the Line, the trucking podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety. This is Kenny Ray, along with my co-hosts, Mr. Mike Bohan and Mr. Jim Seibert, and we thank all of you for joining us today for today's episode. You know, Mike and Jim, in the last episode of Driving the Line, we discussed the difference between priorities, which tend to change based on situations, and core principles, which are unchanging regardless of situation. And, you know, for safety for a trucking company, we came to the conclusion, and it's the right conclusion, we all know this, that safety must be a core principle. And when trucking companies think about safety, and when people outside of trucking think about how safety applies to trucking, they tend to focus on driving safety, on driver behavior. And I was thinking the other day, I was coming back from Houston, and I was thinking about the companies that are the very best in the country in safety, trucking companies. They tend to take a holistic approach. They tend to look at their overall operations, not just focus on driver behavior or driver safety. And I had an interesting discussion last week with the owner of a trucking company. We were talking about the blind spots around trucks, where when drivers look in the mirror, the things they can't see because they're hidden outside the scope of being able to discern them through a mirror. And those blind spots, by definition, are things that you can't see. And while we were discussing this truck owner and I were discussing these blind spots, he made what I thought was an extremely profound statement. He said, you know, we all have blind spots in our lives too. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we have personal blind spots. We have financial blind spots. We end up in our careers with developmental blind spots. He said, even my company, we have organizational blind spots. He said, it's things that I don't even know exist until something bad happens. And then I sit and say, man, I didn't see that coming. And I was thinking about that as we were preparing for this particular episode of Driving the Line. And we're going to talk about OSHA, and we're going to talk about the regulatory effects of OSHA on trucking companies. And I thought, you know, that tends to be a blind spot for trucking companies. I often see almost a seemingly unawareness that OSHA even regulates trucking companies. And when we're talking about OSHA, we're talking about the United States Department of Labor, the Occupational Safety Health Administration. And ladies and gentlemen listening to the episode today, if you do not get anything else from this podcast, know this: OSHA regulates trucking. They regulate your shop, they regulate your tank wash, they regulate your truck wash. If you got 10 or more employees on site, your office facility is even regulated. And we want to just visit with you a little bit today about the impact that OSHA has on the trucking industry. And we're going to flesh out one example for you that I think will bring that into clarity and into focus. And Mike, I want to start with you. You know, every year, you and I have talked about every year, OSHA develops what they call their top 10 list. And those are the most frequently cited violations from the previous year. And, you know, here we are in the early stages of 2023. And so looking back at 2022, talk to our listeners a little bit about OSHA's top 10 list, what that is, and your thoughts on how those various violations apply to trucking.
Yeah, you bet, Kenny. And you're so right. When we go out and we talk to our clients, we're talking to people in the industry, we even often focus on DOT regulations, hazmat regulations, because that's what's in the forefront of our mind. And I don't blame our clients and the folks in the trucking world to focus on those types of regulations as well, because it's what keeps them in business. Today's topic, when we're talking about OSHA, we've got to make sure that we're thinking about those types of regulatory requirements as well. So OSHA they definitely release this list of most frequently cited violations every year. Every year it changes a little bit, but you've always got those certain types of requirements or violations that are cited more often than others. So I'm just going to go through this list And I want everybody that's listening to just think about how the things on this list may apply to your company as a trucking company.
Just for clarity before you start, this isn't an exhaustive list of all the OSHA, but it's the things they most often cited last year.
Right. On this list, it's as they come out and they do their audits or their investigations, these are the top 10 most frequently cited violations from their reports. And this is coming from last year. And again, this changes from year to year, but this is what we looked at from last year. So number 10 on this list, we've got machine guarding. And this could be guards on bench grinders, portable grinders. It could be guards around equipment that have belts and pulleys, things like that. And maintenance facilities, shops, they often have this type of equipment in them. So that's something that you need to think about. Number 9, we've got personal protective and life-saving equipment. And this is eye and face protection. It's going to include things like safety glasses and face shields, which may be required depending on the type of the work that's going on in the shop. There could also be some PPE requirements when loading and unloading specific types of commodities, which is an area that OSHA has jurisdiction over when trucking companies are loading and unloading. Number 8, we've got fall protection and training requirements. So if we've got areas in our business that require fall protection, we have to look at, are we training our employees on proper equipment, proper use to keep them safe from falls? Number 7, powered industrial trucks. Most warehouses, cross-docking operations, they're going to have at least one forklift. Most oftentimes shops are going to have a forklift. So that's something that's going to pertain to us on the trucking side. And I know Jim's got an excellent training program that to get people certified on forklifts. He's been out and worked with some of our clients on the trucking side to help in that respect. Number 6 on the list is lockout tagout procedures. And these procedures are notifying people in our business that if we've got a piece of equipment that is out of service for repair or maintenance, that piece of equipment is not to be used until it's back in working order. A few years ago, I was had a client that they were putting video event recorders in their vehicles, and they invited me down to kind of watch the installation process and how that all worked. And when I got there, they had gone through the lockout tagout procedures for all of their equipment, and just to install cameras in their trucks. And I thought that was really interesting. So once all the cameras have been installed, they put them back in service, and the trucks were ready to go. But that's something that pertains to us, whether it's something as simple as putting cameras in a truck, or maybe there's a reefer unit that's out on a trailer, and we tag that out and we make sure that trailer is not being used because it's not in service. Again, something to think about. Number 5 on our list last year was scaffolding. And this is one of the violations on the list that we may not really see that much in the trucking industry, but it's good information to know. As Jim pointed out to us as we were going through this list, this is something that it was a focus from the OSHA administration, and we just want you to know that was in the top 5 as far as violations go. Number 4 on our list was ladders, and we see ladders all the time in shops. Whether we're working on trucks or trailers, I see it. If you've got a marker light out on a trailer, how's your mechanic going to get that light fixed if he's not using a trailer or not using a ladder to get up on that trailer? So that's something that we're going to see in the shops. Are they properly maintained? Are they properly stored in shops all over the place? Number 3, respiratory protection. Again, this might be something depending on the commodity hauled that would apply to a trucking company. Number 2, hazard communication. Communicating the hazards of the chemicals present in the shop. And if you walk through a shop, it's really easy to miss how many different chemicals there are in the hazards that they present. And then number 1 on the list, and I think there was more than twice the number of violations in this category as any other category on the list in this top 10, and it's fall protection, just general requirements. And this is often going to apply to drivers who may have to climb on a trailer while loading or unloading, or there's elevated work in a shop. I know a company that they haul plastic resin in pneumatic tanks, and they top load the material into the tank through a manhole. And for a lot of years, they had drivers climbing on the tanks during the loading process. And even with proper training and proper fall protection, they identified the hazard that this loading process presented to their employees. So they had an engineer come in and design this system where they had 2 ladders going up either side of the tank, and the ladders were connected with a catwalk, and the drivers would put on a harness in this new system, and they would connect into the system. So at all times during the loading process, they were protected from falls. And the reason that this company took those measures is because they knew OSHA had standards that were mandating them to keep their employees safe during that loading process. And as we've mentioned throughout this, it's the goal of these regulations to keep our employees safe. So there's a lot that applies when we look at this list. If this is the low-hanging fruit, if this is the most cited violations that we see throughout the year, this is something that we should pay attention to in the trucking industry. Because when we go down through this top 10 list, there's many of them that affect us on the trucking side, and we just don't think about it. But they affect us just like DOT regulations, just like hazmat regulations, those things that we often think about every day. So we kind of need to have a mindset shift and realize that this is just as important.
Yeah. Mike, as you were going down that list, and you did such a great job describing, but I actually got a visual image, a mental picture of every one of those violations, because I've seen every single one of them. And you made the point about scaffolding. That's probably the one that is least applicable to the trucking industry. But even then, if a company is expanding their shop, they're building a new shop, they're adding on to their office facility, they may have a contractor, a construction contractor on site that's using scaffolding, so they at least can relate to the way that applies. But those other 9, there's not a single one of those other 9 that's far-fetched in our industry. They all apply to trucking, every single one of them. And Jim, as you were listening to that list, as Mike was going down it, Mike and I talked about the one that we see a lot, and he talked about it briefly, was number 2 on OSHA's list, and it's hazard communication. And this is one, a lot of times, because of the way that OSHA standard is named, a lot of trucking companies say, well, I'm not a hazmat trucking company, so that doesn't apply to me, does it? And they're totally incorrect about that. Hazard communication really is unrelated to the transportation of hazardous material. It's more talking about hazards that are on site at a trucking company, in a shop, at a tank wash, whatever. And so, Jim, Mike and I, we lovingly call you our OSHA guru, and you clearly have much more expertise in OSHA than Mike and I do. But take that one OSHA violation, that number 2 on the list, hazard communication. Briefly tell our listeners, what is that? What's the OSHA standard? And ladies and gentlemen listening, OSHA calls their regulation standard. So when Jim uses the term standard, that means an OSHA regulation. So Jim, tell us, what is that standard? What is that OSHA reg? And what are some very practical or pragmatic ways that a trucking company might see that particular OSHA standard applied to their operation? Would you do that for us, Jim, please, sir?
Yeah, happy to, Kenny. Thanks for the recap there, Mike. Interesting observations about that top 10 list for sure. And as I scroll, I see the number of almost double for the fall protection than some of the others. And as we're scanning that top 10, look at the special emphasis, the focus around the slips, trips, and falls and working from elevation in that list. And when we think about cross-docking operations and shops and service stations, that elevated work, there's 4 that are related to slips, trips, and falls. And that 1926 in the construction industry, well, in the 1910, you have the subpart D, and there's hints of elevated work and the slips, trips, and falls across all of that. Overall, that top 10 is not very surprising for those of us OSHA guys in the industry. There's a sleeper in the group, and that's the one that you've referred to, Kenny, the 1910.1200, the hazard communication. And it's the sleeper in the group for the reasons that you've stated. A misconception of what it is and the hazardous material handling and things of that nature. And we overlook common use items. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the common use items. So hazardous communication, it's a standard to ensure that all hazards of all chemicals are classified with a set list of provisions and that these provisions are communicated to employees through training, warning signage, container labeling, and safety data sheets. That's an extremely brief description of all that the 1200 hazard communication lays out. But we want to stay high level. Now that we've kind of hit that high level, OSHA's number 2 for 2022, let's place it in a practical scenario here. And maybe we can find and build some commonality in the DOT world and the applicability to this certain OSHA regulation standard. So let's go to our shop. And if you will, let's just mentally picture this scenario and the hopes that we would have come out of this scenario and some of the fears that we might have. So many of you listeners, you're going to relate to having a shop to service your fleet, or your employees, your drivers might find themselves in another shop and having a driver that is aware of common hazards found in that shop place you would find beneficial. So Mike and Kenny, you two have probably been in hundreds of shops throughout your careers. What types of items, just off the top of your head, do you think you might find which would require a safety data sheet?
The one that always comes to mind, and it's one I use often as an example, are aerosol cans of brake cleaner. The mechanics use them for everything under the sun. And, most of the time, and I certainly want to yield to your expertise on this, but anytime Mike or I walk through a truck shop, we see mechanics working on trucks, doing what they're supposed to be doing with full good intentions. And they've got all of these materials lined up around them, not just their tools, but all these aerosol cans, and they'll have little plastic bottles filled with unknown liquids. And you just, it almost looks like a chemistry operation while they're there working on that truck. So, but I'll just throw out brake cleaner is one we see a lot.
Loctite. You mentioned little plastic bottles. Well, Loctite. So certain bolts and nuts, and there's an application, and there's different colors of Loctite for the components of its adhesive properties. So one's for vibration, one's for, you put Loctite on this, it's never coming off again. So there's another little thing that I call them tools of the trade. Yeah. These mechanics, professionals. Any other examples?
Well, a lot of times we're going to see different types of combustible liquids, whether it's, gas, we've got diesel in smaller containers, we've got oil that is in there, in various containers throughout the shop. If you've got, depending on what the shop looks like, let's say they've got somebody out there washing trucks or washing trailers in the yard, and they've got a little gas operated power washer out there. Well, they might have a gas can in the shop somewhere to fill that thing up, and it's just sitting in the corner over there, and that's the type of stuff that may get overlooked as you're walking through, because it's just sitting in the corner. They're not really maybe using it in the shop, but it's in the shop,
And Jim, a lot of time these materials that Mike and I see, the volume of them, not only individual containers, but the amount that they have on site is a function of how big the trucking. You take a trucking company that's got 300 or 400, 500 trucks, they may be buying material in 330-gallon totes and actually sitting it inside their shop using a forklift to do that. So, it's much more than just an aerosol can of brake cleaner. I mean, we literally could have 100, 200 gallons of some of these materials properly inside the shop itself. So these mechanics are surrounded all the time by some of these work-related chemicals.
Right. We've got the tank washers. There's acids, some caustics, solvent. We've got neutralizers out there to, for tank cleaning operations of, washing out products. You guys are putting together already what I'm setting this example up for. So let's roll out this scenario now for our listeners using a common product found in almost every home and shop. And let's see if we can figure out what I'm talking about. You have a mechanic performing some routine maintenance in your company shop. He is approached by an individual who looks important and has a clipboard. We've all seen that individual walk up before. The clipboard person begins asking your mechanic about a product they're using at the time. Questions like, Hey, what's that product used for? Does it burn when it hits your skin? Has it ever gotten your eyes? Is it flammable? Immediately followed by what if it did, or what if it is type questions. You as the manager or the owner operator of this shop and that mechanic, what types of hopes, what types of fears stir up in you when you see a regulatory official approaching one of your employees and starting to ask some hard questions? Fortunately, in this scenario, we're going to say the employee's been trained, and that employee refers the inspector to the Right to Know Center, the SDS, or the Safety Data Sheet Center, where he quickly locates the safety data sheet for the product. He is able to answer the questions with ease, utilizing the sections of the SDS associated with the questions. So let's look at this particular SDS and let's read some identifiers of it. Section number 2, the hazard identification. Well, from section number 2, I can tell that it's an extremely flammable aerosol. It's a gas cylinder. It contains gas under pressure, may explode if heated, may be fatal if swallowed and enters airways, may cause drowsiness or dizziness. That employee is also able to flip over to first aid measures to be taken in case it is ingested, it's swallowed. They discuss eye contact, skin contact, what happens if it is inhaled. And it also describes in section 4 the signs and symptoms of that exposure. So that employee was able to direct the inspector to the SDS sections that answered the questions the inspector had. In so doing, that employee demonstrated that they had been trained on how to utilize the SDS and how to recognize and address situations that might arise from using that product. The inspector goes further in questioning the employee and says, what are the exposure controls and the personal protection, the PPE requirements for you using that at this facility? The employee reads out, following controls are recommended for normal consumer use of this product. And so the PPEs for normal consumer use are a lot less restrictive than the PPE for bulk processing or workplace use. So at that point, the inspector identifies a hole in the training because this particular product has multiple use applications and can be used as a residential use. So in the training, the employee was not trained on the correct PPE to use, and in so doing was observed not wearing the appropriate PPE for the product. So what is this common use product? Let me tell you some of the product use, and let's see if you can guess it at home or if Kenny or Mike can name it. So product use. Now, this is common again. I've said it in residence and in the workplace. It is a lubricant, a penetrant. It drives out moisture, removes and protects surfaces from corrosion.
You know, Jim, when you, the last part of what you just shared, when you started sharing the uses, it brought me to where I think I know what this product is, but I'm going to tell you, the first part of what you were describing, man, this sounded like an inhalation hazard poison. You know, if I get it inside me, it's fatal. If I get it in my eyes, I need to go to, emergency eye wash station and it'll burn my skin. And I think it's interesting. And I probably would not have picked the product. I'm going to tell you what I think it's WD-40 is what I think you're describing.
That was my guess too, Ken.
Yeah, WD-40. But I'm going to say this, and I've used WD-40 a zillion times. I did not realize the safety data sheet for WD-40 differentiated between a household or a residential use and a commercial use in a shop. And I think it's interesting that you picked that product, if Mike and I got it right, that you picked that product, because I've never been in a truck shop. And I can say this with 100% certainty. I've never been in a truck shop that I have not seen a mechanic using WD-40 for something. They use it for everything under the sun.
WD-40 is correct. And so when we're talking, and thanks for bringing that up, Kenny, the different PPE requirements dependent upon the use or where it's used for bulk processing or workplace use, you mentioned eye protection. Safety goggles recommended where eye contact is possible. How many situations where we're using WD-40 is eye contact not possible is one of my questions. Chemical resistant gloves. Ventilation requirements. If ventilation is good, it's not required. But if it's not, and you're using it in a restricted area, doors closed, they recommend a respirator. When we think of something as common as WD-40 in the workplace, and as easy as it is to use, and the many applications that we use it for, what about the special application items? What about those products we talked about earlier? What about the acidics or the caustics, the tank washer, the neutralizer compounds, the solvents, the solvent washer, the brake cleaners? Carb cleaner is another pretty common one, as used as a degreaser that has a lot of application in the shop. So closing from my perspective, going back to the requirements of the hazard communication, that 1910.1200, the employees, the communication through training is imperative. Having a program and discussing the important sections of a safety data sheet. Your employees being able to identify the warning signage, the global harmonized systems warning symbols. That symbology is important, and being able to identify the picture, they can figure out just from a picture, in most cases, the level of PPE or some of the PPE requirements. Container labeling, all of that is important so that you don't end up with buckets of stuff sitting around your shop floor and nobody knows what's in it. And then you might dispose of it improperly.
Yeah.
So the safety data sheets and the employee training and a good inventory of all products that are located in your shop, that's the starting point.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Jim, thank you. And I love the fact that you used even though it was a hypothetical, a very practical example of how that a mechanic using a material, and he had been trained. He knew where the safety data sheet was. He knew where the sections were within the SDS that went to the information he needed. But we see that an oversight, a blind spot, if you will, was found on that particular SDS because it had two applicable uses, and he'd been trained on the one he wasn't using it for. And but the example you laid out, just looking at the HAZCOM standard, hazard communication. So a trucking company would take, and they first would do a comprehensive interview or a comprehensive inventory and discover what are the materials in my shop that we're using, and then make sure they have an SDS for each one of those materials. And I want to tell you, we've all three been in this industry long enough to know it used to be a hard search to find SDSs. They're all available online now. These companies have been very proactive because they don't want the liability of keeping their safety information away from their customers. So it's simple now to get a safety data sheet. And then once you get them and you gather them and you put them in a right to know station or a place where the employees have access to them, then you train the employees on those. And the whole thrust of our podcast, our episode today, was to use one example out of the OSHA top 10 list, just purely as an example, to show trucking companies that, hey, OSHA regulates you. So again, ladies and gentlemen, listen to this podcast. If you don't get anything else from this, know this: OSHA regulates the trucking industry. And don't let that fact, and that is a fact, don't let that fact be a blind spot in your particular operation. So if you're sitting there now and you say, I need to know more about OSHA, or I didn't realize that, or man, he just picked one thing off of that list, and basically all the other ones apply to me as well. I want to encourage you to reach out to your safety director, reach out to your safety team, reach out to whoever your safety resource is and say, hey, I need to know more about OSHA. What do I do? Where do I start? So Mike and Jim, we're getting ready to wrap up. I want to thank both of you. I always do. I love working with you guys. Appreciate your expertise and your experience. Anything y'all, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but anything you want to add before we close about OSHA for regulating the trucking industry?
I was going to say this, and you already said it. I was just going to say it in a different way. A lot of times, as I go out and I'm working with our clients, and over the years, and even prior to coming to MMA, a lot of times trucking companies realize OSHA applies to them and their standards apply to them when worst case scenario happens. Yeah. So we just want you all to know that are listening. Let's get ahead of this and just understand that there's some standards out there that apply to you that hopefully will help keep your employees safe, keep them away from harm. That's the goal of this, and to understand that these standards apply, and that's why we're talking about them today, because we don't want worst case scenario to be the reason why you understand now that OSHA applies to you.
Yeah, we want to make sure this wasn't one of their blind spots in their operation.
Absolutely.
Like you mentioned, whenever one of those tragedies occur and OSHA comes in, they just realize, man, that was a blind spot I wasn't prepared for. So thank you for wrapping that up. Ladies and gentlemen, on our next episode, we're going to dive off into the world of hours of service. We'll be talking about logbooks. We'll be talking about ELDs. We'll be talking about the 4 most recent changes to the federal hours of service regulations. We want to invite you back to listen in on that episode as we dig deep into the world of hours of service. And until then, thank you for the staff of Driving the Line. Again, we are the podcast that is always in pursuit of safety, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for joining us.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.